Okay guys, so welcome to the Anvil, Laws of Strength, law number 3. Today we're going to be talking about individuality, okay, and the notion of it's one thing everyone says, or what works for you doesn't necessarily work for me, how much truth there is to that and how it overall has an influence on training. So, first and foremost, we are the snowflake species, which kind of sounds like a juxtaposition, but essentially everyone is unique, particularly in this day and age where we all have our own voice, we all have our own way of doing things, and we value that from a standpoint of freedom and everything else. But overall, and we do have individual responses to certain stimulus, but overall we are still a species, which means from a taxonomical standpoint, we have enough genetic, behavioural, physiological, anatomical, all these different things, we have enough similarities to quantify us as a similar species, which means when the body is placed under load, it will typically respond with an elevated muscle protein synthesis, an increase in strength, and so on. And this is where there tends to be a bit of ambiguity. You tend to see people what are known as non-responders, either in the research or from an anecdotal standpoint as well, which don't necessarily adapt and improve as much as other people, but it comes down to how that program is executed rather than it simply not working for that person. So typically we know that, as we saw with the previous law, or the previous two laws, if we consistently provide the body with a specific stimulus towards a fitness component, we know that that person will improve. It's just to what magnitude and, like I said, how they go about doing it. And this comes into, we'll talk about the psychological aspect shortly, but individuality isn't just about the exercise selection. Okay, there are 9 key movements that the body should be able to do and should be loaded through in order to create what's known as a balanced, structurally strong position, or person rather, which is that you should be able to squat, do some form of hip hinge, a unilateral movement, triple extend, some form of walk, loaded carry, run, that type of thing, vertical pushing, vertical pulling, horizontal pushing, horizontal pulling. If you do all 9 of them, you're structurally a strong individual. Obviously, the individuality comes into it. Will if people have any anthropomorphic deformities, i.e. either the knee replacement or an injury in one of those different areas that alters the ability to move through one of those movement patterns, that's where we will tailor the program to be able to ensure that that individual is addressing all of the issues that come about as a result of not being able to perform that movement. However, when it comes to those 9 movements, that is standard across the board. Okay, every single person, going back to that species side of thing, every single person should be able to and should load those movements. The difference in individuality is how often you load them, how you perform that technique. So for example, the squat it's essentially, those 9 movements are essentially ways in which the body move that are relatively similar, so they can be grouped together. But that doesn't mean they are absolutely minutely the same across everyone. One person might squat with their feet slightly wider, one person might squat with them narrow and their toes pointed forward. That's where the individuality comes into play, more so from a standpoint of how that person executes the exercise rather than whether they do the exercise at all. So exercise selection should be pretty standard. It's more down to one of 2 things, either A, how they perform the movement, or B, going into the psychological aspect. So one of the things that we tend to see, unless you are an incredibly advanced individual, in which case the specific variation that you do will elicit a pretty significant adaptation, as a beginner, doing a press up will get you stronger within a horizontal pushing movement. Doing a form of loaded squat will get you stronger, okay? It doesn't necessarily matter as much in terms of the overall overload that's placed from a standpoint of which variation that they do, with wider foot position, as we mentioned earlier. The difference is how we learn, so how the body and brain respond to that movement, and trying to balance across different aspects of our psychology. So let's take, for example, an individual that is working on the squat. Okay, they don't enjoy the squat movement. So going back to those other 2 laws, although it is a specific exercise and it's specific to that person, the first law that has to be addressed is consistency. So that individual here doesn't enjoy squatting on a regular basis. It doesn't serve them necessarily to have to squat all the time at a high frequency. Okay, unless they are a competitive athlete that needs to squat, in which case we'll talk about the psychology in a moment. It doesn't necessarily serve them or anyone else to place that exercise at the top of the priority. Myself, for example, my absolute favourite exercise of all time has and probably will always be the deadlift. Now, in many instances, it's more important for me to squat because of different structural issues that I've had with injuries in the past and everything like that. But when my training isn't in the competitive season and I'm focusing purely on just enjoying training, I will always gravitate towards the deadlift. Okay, and this is where we talk about the psychology of the individual and how you are as a person. Now, there tends to be two different types of people that are either process oriented, okay, or achievement and goal oriented. Now, people that are process oriented tend to not care too much about tests or, you know, working towards a specific goal. They just enjoy the notion of routine, okay. In this instance, it's great because they appreciate the notion of incremental progression, but they don't necessarily push themselves out of their comfort zone because they're not necessarily working towards anything, and there is no consequence if they don't actually work towards it. So they enjoy the process a little bit more. Achievement oriented people are on the exact opposite end of the spectrum. So if they're not working towards anything, they often struggle to stay motivated because they simply don't feel like there's, you know, enough of a consequence should they not turn up to training or do the revision or so on. The problem with this is, or rather the benefit of this, is that they tend to be very, very hard workers, okay? So when they are motivated and that decision's been made, there's nothing stopping them. The issue is they tend to be fixated so much on a goal that if they don't have a goal, or worse still, not necessarily the goal, they don't have the motive behind the goal. So even if I as a coach were to give them a goal, if they don't make that decision themselves, they'll tend to be the type of people that cycle in and out of high stages of motivation rather than being consistent. And as we talked about, the first law is consistency. It's not about effort, okay? It's about incremental progression. So it doesn't matter if you work really hard over 4 weeks. If you stop for 2 weeks, that's not as good as working moderately difficult, a moderate difficulty rather, throughout the course of that whole time period. So we need to try and find a balance between the two. And again, this is where the individuality side of things comes into play. If you are an individual who is primarily achievement focused, over the long term, from a short term standpoint, we'll obviously continue to utilise that. But over the long term, it's about trying to strike a little bit of a balance about the process as well, so that we keep in mind consistency and longevity in your training. On the flip side, people that are process oriented, we sometimes need to push you out of your comfort zone, get you in a scenario where you're being challenged, so that we gain the notion of the difference on effort level, because a lot of people get stuck into, as the saying kind of goes, a routine very quickly becomes a rut. You think you're putting in effort, but you're not necessarily pushing yourself as much as you can. And again, going back to that notion of non-responders or finding a program that might not necessarily work, unless you are an advanced individual, it's not necessarily the specific program itself, okay? It's the individual who performs that program and how much effort they put in, what the motive is behind it, and how they execute each exercise rather than the specific variation. Within the fitness industry nowadays, we often get into the kind of mindset that, oh, it's that specific exercise that's going to make all the difference. It does have a huge bearing, and obviously if you can find a way of overloading mechanical demand in a way that is more beneficial to that individual, it will have a huge difference. I'm not saying that, you know, a bodyweight squat is the same as an overhead squat or a front squat. It obviously isn't. Things like load, spinal stability, challenging fatigue and time under tension, they all have they are the bread and butter of training. However, fundamentally, it's about, like I said, how you execute the movement and what the motive is behind it. And finally, we go into the needs analysis standpoint. So this is the concept of a needs analysis. When an individual goes into a hospital, they get their MOT or they get screened for things like blood pressure, height, weight, BMI, even though we don't necessarily like that, and all these different metrics, okay, or as from a business standpoint, you could look at it as a KPI. A lot of metrics, and there is normative data to compare that individual to. In this standpoint, let's say your blood pressure is 140 over 100, let's say. There is objective data to say that isn't ideal, you need to bring it back down again. Right on the other end of the spectrum, when you work with professional athletes, they have the same thing. So they have the normative data that they go through. They'll have tests such as flexibility tests, mobility tests, speed tests, all these different types of things. They'll get flagged up as a red if they don't address or they don't meet the certain criteria. Whereas in the fitness industry, it seems to be, just do what you want, do what you enjoy, you know, that's all that matters. And unfortunately, again, that's because we've kind of played to this notion that the individual has all the knowledge about what they want. But there's a huge difference between what an individual wants and what an individual needs. And again, it's about striking that balance all the way through. So a needs analysis takes into account goal setting. I'll always get the individual to state what their goal is. But from a professional standpoint, I will utilise testing procedures and a needs analysis to be able to assess where you are along that spectrum. If you come to me and say, John, I really want to get to the strongest squat I possibly can. Like, that's my only goal. That's all I've got my mindset fixed on. And I say, great, we do a needs analysis and you get out of breath walking up the stairs. I'm going to structure the program to address the need before the want, because ultimately that's what upholds the want. We'll talk about that in a later date with regard to what's known as the layer theory, but the layer theory and the concept of the law of individuality are intricately tied in terms of how we execute movements, what the exercise selection is, like I said, and ultimately what our mindset is when we approach each form of exercise that we do. Oftentimes people will say, oh, well, I like doing this and I like doing that, and for me, concepts of neurolinguistics, it's easy to see that the people that tend to state the words I want, or I enjoy doing that, or I prefer doing that, are the ones that tend to bow in and out of a motivational cycle rather than staying relatively consistent, because ultimately training should be fun, but it also should be a job that needs to be done as well. So that's the law of individuality. It's a little bit longer there, but obviously, like I said, it's the juxtaposition of the snowflake species and how that ties into training. Our final law is going to be talking about progressive overload and ultimately how we bring all of these to a head and how the program will be structured.